Recent genetic findings regarding the ancient populations of Britain and Ireland show a possible Bronze Age immigration that has caused some sensational headlines in the mainstream media, with some now declaring that the Irish are not really Celts. What's behind this claim? What are these new genetic findings, and what does it really mean for the identities of the Gaels and the Welsh? Are the Irish really Celts? Hi friends, I'm Kevin McLean. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and consider supporting me on Patreon or PayPal. Much thanks to all of my supporters. Before looking into this further, it would be useful to first know what a Celt actually is. Primarily, when academics talk about Celts, they are speaking about a people descended from an Indo-European lineage who speak a language belonging to a particular branch of Indo-European, and who likewise share various cultural aspects found in association with it, much like people use the term Germanic to refer to both someone from Austria and Iceland, despite their differences. The ethnonym is first used by the ancient Greeks, but as often or more often, these same people are called Galatai, or Gauls. Though the Celts in Iberia spoke a language quite removed from the Gauls, who battled the Greeks at Thermopylae, they originated from a common source. Since 2016, a number of studies have demonstrated that the Irish and the British populations of the early Bronze Age were almost exclusively derived from a group termed the Bell Beakers. This label perhaps is not particularly helpful, for there were several different groups with different genetic origins that are all labeled Bell Beakers. The people who settled Britain and Ireland did not originate, as some early theories had thought, from Iberia, but they crossed over from Holland, and very likely originated from the nearby corded ware culture, or are very closely genetically related to it. They had very prominent R1b male haplogroups and carried a high percentage of Indo-European steppe ancestry. They mastered early shipbuilding techniques, likely the same types of ships represented on Scandinavian rock art from around the same period. And by about 2500 BC, they began to migrate into Britain and Ireland, replacing approximately 93% of the Neolithic farmers in the islands over the next 500 years. This is the highest level of population replacement anywhere in Europe, with the preceding Neolithic population virtually disappearing, either killed off in conflict, disease, or otherwise totally excluded from the gene pool. Without a doubt, these Dutch Bell Beakers spoke an Indo-European language. However, if the population of Ireland was largely descended from people who crossed over from Holland in the Chalcolithic, the question is, when and how did the Celtic language come to Britain and Ireland? Now, a study published in Nature tries to provide further insight into the population of Bronze Age Britain. The study concludes that between 1450 and 850 BC, there was a large migration from Gaul, with possibly up to a 50% population replacement in parts of southern England and Wales. To some, this is proof that the Celtic language entered Britain at this time. The way the study detected this population movement was through tracking the Neolithic admixture rates in the DNA. The local British population of the early Bronze Age had a lower Neolithic farmer admixture at around 34% according to the study, compared to Central or Western European rates at that time, which varied between 45 and 55%. The incoming population increased the Neolithic admixture component in southern England and Wales by several percentage points, which the researchers believe matches with an immigration from Gaul. Archaeologically, on a regional level, there is also observed some different building structures and burial styles coming into a limited area in southeastern Britain, However, the study also showed that there was no noticeable change in Scotland, and based on earlier evidence from Ireland, we can likely conclude much the same there. That isn't all. The study further concludes that after about 850 BC, there appears to have been very little immigration into Britain from Gaul, although it is possible that the testing methodology around this question is somewhat flawed, as the migration between nearly identical populations would be increasingly difficult to see using the methods they've chosen. But to many, this study is confirmation that the Celtic language entered Britain with this influx from Gaul during the mid to late Bronze Age. Others, however, have pointed to problems with this study. The immigration was slow, relatively localized, and the increase in admixture was diffused over time. Such immigration doesn't always lead to a change in language. So for instance, if mostly elites were immigrating, then we would expect that to be more likely to lead to a language shift, because the language spoken usually shifts to match the language of the ruling elite. However, we can't really determine this from the study, because it was focused on tracking these admixture rates. And that leads to the other criticism, which is that it has been suggested that the evidence shows primarily women arriving. But this can be explained by the regional nature of the proposed migration, from areas that predominantly shared the same haplogroups that were found in Britain. However, because the study relies so heavily on this idea of tracking the increased percentage of Neolithic farmer admixture, it cannot be viewed, in my opinion, as conclusive, but only perhaps suggestive. There were also a number of cultural changes that took place during the late Bronze Age. The use of torques began to spread throughout Britain and Ireland. Now, the torque is, of course, one of the prime symbols of the Celtic nobility. We see exquisite examples of such a torque found in late Bronze Age Ireland. Evidence for horse riding. Burial practices do change on a massive scale, but they don't change in the way that people expect. It's not dramatic. The Balbeaker folk practiced a mixture of inhumation and cremation. But in the late Bronze Age, that shifts to exclusively cremation. And that change matches the changes that are going on in the continent with the Urnfield culture, who shift to purely cremation. And of course, their culture is named for their cremation style. Hill forts begin to be built in the late Bronze Age. But the reality is that these cultures, whether in Ireland, whether in Gaul, whether in Germany, are all very similar, and they come from identical origins. But these people haven't been separate from each other the whole time, living on alien planets. They've been exchanging goods. Communities in Britain and Ireland would have had established relationships with tribes on the continent. Likely relationships solidified with the exchanging of women. A final objection is that this is simply too early for the introduction of a Proto-Celtic language. This final objection, often linked to the idea of the Hallstatt Celts spreading Proto-Celtic, is, I think, demonstrably wrong. And to understand this, we have to understand the complexity of the development of the Celtic languages and other European languages generally. So, to try to understand this full situation, we are, to the pleasure of some and the agony, I suspect, of many, going to have to get into the linguistic weeds. The languages traditionally spoken in Ireland and Britain are anciently linked to the Celtic languages of Gaul and Iberia because they share similar features theorized to have originated from the same ancestral source. Gaelic and Welsh also share certain similarities with each other, which are grouped by some as Insular Celtic. Most importantly, they have a VSO word order, which is unique to them. Earlier theories tried to link this to some pre-Indo-European influence, but more recent research has demonstrated the existence of the use of a VSO word order in Proto-Indo-European for the purpose of emphasis, and it may be this use of the emphatic style which gave rise to a new standard in Ireland and Britain. However, Brythonic and Goidelic are also quite different from each other in important respects, such as vocabulary, sound, and syntax. One very noticeable difference is that Goidelic lacks the P sound. Where there is a P in Brythonic and Gaulish, one will instead find a Q or later a C in Goidelic. For example, pen means head in Welsh, but ken in Old Gaelic. Map, later mab, means son or boy in Welsh, but mac in Gaelic. Cruthyn means a Pictish person in Old Gaelic, but it's from the Brythonic term Prytan, later Britain. Epos is horse in Gaulish, but ech in Old Gaelic, from a Goidelic equus, Proto-Celtic equus. Thus, the languages are sometimes distinguished by calling them P-Celtic or Q-Celtic. The sound represented by P in Gaulish and Brythonic developed from a Proto-Indo-European qu, which is how the sound is preserved in archaic Gaelic. Another difference is the Proto-Celtic W, so windos means white or fair in Proto-Celtic. It's gwyn in Welsh, but fin in Old Gaelic. Though there is a fair amount of vocabulary overlap, there are some interesting omissions, such as father, ather in Old Gaelic, losing the Indo-European P sound, as Celtic did. But in Welsh, the cognate is edryth, meaning instead home. There is no consensus as to exactly when these distinctions developed, but they indicate a fairly long and independent period of development. These changes occurred in a chain, that is, from Proto-Indo-European to Proto-Celtic, and then from Proto-Celtic qu, the sound either becomes a k or it becomes a p. There cannot be a situation where the language adopted the p sound from qu and then reverted to a k or qu. It demonstrates beyond doubt that when the Celtic language entered Ireland, it was in the form of Proto-Celtic. And on this stage of the language, we can place a conservative date range that makes a late Bronze Age arrival of Celtic into Britain and Ireland very realistic. Our earliest inscriptions from Lepontic, a dialect or very closely related language to Gaulish, date to about 550 BC. These were a people who spoke a Celtic language in the northern region of modern-day Italy. Romans believed that they had migrated south from Gaul. At this time, their language was already P-Celtic. Our earliest sources of Gaulish show it was also P-Celtic. Therefore, it is certain that by at least 600 BC, the Gauls were already speaking a language distinct from the earlier Proto-Celtic. Any arrival of Celtic language into Ireland would have to predate this by necessity. However, it is not out of the question that the Brythonic P form and the general linguistic divide between Goidelic and Brythonic was a result of later Gaulish influences upon a population already speaking a closely connected language derived from Proto-Celtic. In regards to the recent genetic paper, Sir Barry Cunliffe remarked that if the migration from Gaul represented any language change at all, it was the division between Goidelic and Brythonic. Now personally I find this view rather untenable, for he is assuming that Proto-Celtic spread with the Beaker folk, or even earlier as he says. Now it's absolutely impossible for it to have been earlier, and highly unlikely that it was the language that actually spread with the Beaker folk in 2500 BC. In fact, that's basically off the table. However, a later Bronze Age date is not at all out of the question. Our latest possible date for its arrival is 600 BC, and that is being extremely conservative, assuming that the first written instance of Gaulish or a related language is directly following its adoption of P for Qu, signaling the end of the period of Proto-Celtic in Gaul. This verifiable evidence of a latest possible date corresponds to the general view that Proto-Celtic existed sometime between 1300 and 800 BC. Thus was a late Bronze Age linguistic grouping, ending with the onset of the Iron Age. Not coincidentally, perhaps, is that these dates directly line up with the recent genetic study of Britain, which potentially shows an incoming population from Gaul at exactly this time, and it also lines up fairly neatly with the date range of the Urnfield culture, which would, in the Iron Age, give rise to the Hallstatt culture. A number of linguists propose a stage between Proto-Celtic and Proto-Indo-European called Italo-Celtic. This is based on similar features in the languages. It's generally believed that Proto-Italic peoples migrated into the Italian peninsula from the north, likely sometime in the late Bronze Age. Our earliest Old Latin is thought to date to approximately 700 BC, meaning even at this early date, it was already distinct from Italic. If we postulate backwards from this, assuming an Italo-Celtic period, it is very clear to see that Proto-Celtic would have had to have been Bronze Age, with local forms emerging at the dawn of the Iron Age akin to Latin and Homeric Greek. So now, perhaps it's better to explain this general linguistic evolution in another way. The Bell Beaker folk, starting from 2500 BC, spread a dialect of Proto-Indo-European throughout much of Western Europe. Over time, local dialects of this language would begin to emerge until the Middle Bronze Age. We can expect there were likely dozens of languages, still with a high degree of mutual intelligibility, spoken throughout France, Germany, Britain, and Iberia. The vast majority of these languages or dialects did not survive into the historical period. One of them that did somewhat survive is Lusitanian, but we barely know anything about it. Some scholars debated whether it was Celtic or not. It seems not. It seems to be a separate Indo-European language that somehow ended up in Iberia, maybe spread, maybe, by the Bell Beaker people. So among this Bell Beaker Indo-European linguistic soup emerged Proto-Celtic, most likely somewhere in Gaul or in southwestern Germany. And from the same or a nearby population also emerged Proto-Italic. And from here, sometime likely in the Middle Bronze Age, Celtic forms of Indo-European speech began to spread out in all directions from among the people that were similar genetically and linguistically. And it made this spread much, much easier. But also much more invisibly in archaeology and genetics. And so it's most likely that the language was adopted in Britain and Ireland sometime in the late Bronze Age, brought by a warrior elite perhaps, displacing the closely related Bell Beaker elite. Or perhaps some sort of peaceful exchange somehow brought the language. They would have brought with them the Druids, the Bards, and the key aspects that we associate with Celtic today. But in other respects, they simply continued on with local styles and traditions. Certain regional particularities in speech by the early Bell Beaker people were possibly preserved in insular Celtic. Now, whether or not this genetic study in nature actually proves a biological migration, Proto-Celtic had to have come to Britain and Ireland during the Bronze Age because it was brought there by people who spoke Proto-Celtic. Not Gaulish, not Celt-Iberian, but the earliest form of the language, a form of the language which almost certainly no longer existed in the Iron Age. So are the Gaels Celts? They speak a Celtic language, they adopted the Celtic culture, and they have identical genetic origins in that they are both a people derived from the Indo-Europeans that spread throughout Western Europe. Their genetics were slightly different from that of Gaul, but they traced much of their male lineage back to the same group of Indo-Europeans. It seems clear to me that the answer is yes, of course they are Celtic, just as someone from Austria is Germanic, yet not identical to a person from Norway or England. It seems to me that some people are using Celtic in a way that is more restrictive and more explicitly biological than identical terms used to refer to other population groups such as Slavic or Germanic, European ethno-linguistic groups that are not actually identical genetically. And it's only on this sort of mechanistic genetic basis that someone could claim that the Irish are not Celts. Yet the original Celtic speakers emerged from the same group of Indo-Europeans that settled Ireland and Britain, so the distinctions, even on this front, are minuscule, highlighted by the near invisibility of any kind of migration into Britain and Ireland by this group in genetic studies, and why some people feel that this study is ultimately inadequate to prove the claim. But I think even without this genetic study, we can pretty well know that it had to have been in the late Bronze Age. Anyhow, don't forget to give a like, a thumbs up, subscribe, check out my Patreon page, and as always, stand tall.